Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Quynn Johnson, no preferred pronouns, and I am the co-founder and director of arts education for Soul Defined Percussive Dance Company, as well as a national teaching artist, performing artist, and children's author.
And good evening. I am Ryan Johnson. I use the he, him pronouns. I am the co-founder and artistic director of Soul Defined Percussive Dance Company. I'm a scholar, arts activist, performing artist. I am the grandson of Barbara Jackson, and I am the son of Dr. Vanessa Jackson. We are reflecting on the violence against Black bodies that has taken place both recently and historically in this country, as well as the embedded white supremacy in our dance community. In alignment with our mission, it is essential for us to be visible and vocal with the community at this time. As we begin, we first must take a minute of silence to honor and acknowledge those Black lives, known and unknown, that have been assassinated by police brutality and hate. Thank you. Quinn and I welcome you to this solution-oriented conversation from what is known as Washington, D.C. region, which is occupied an unceded territory, the ancestral homeland of the Powhatan, Pamunkey, and Piscataway people, and many more whose histories have been erased. We acknowledge that the foundation of this country was funded by the sale of enslaved Africans and built by their forced labor.
Comments or questions for the panelists in the chat as you watch. Thank you so much to TR Bridges for providing the ASL interpretation for today's conversation, and to Monica and Tiffany for being the interpreters for our conversation.
Now, today we get to put someone in the hot seat that we value and respect, not only as an artist, but as the artistic executive director of Dance Place. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce to you Christopher K. Morgan.
Aloha, y'all. Great to see you and great to be with you today. I'm Christopher Morgan, Executive Artistic Director of Dance Place, and my pronouns are he, his, and him. It's really great to be with you, Quinn, Ryan, Monica, Tiffany.
And we're happy that you're here.
For
now,
sure.
Christopher, we're not going to hold back. It is going down, okay? So it was really important for us to have this conversation with you first. We have had two great town halls that were very successful that we were only able to do with your support, the support of Dance Place, you and your team. And we want to acknowledge that and we want to lift that up. But that also brought us to a lot of conversations to learn a lot about things that may need to change or alter within the walls of Dance Place. So this conversation is putting you in a hot seat. And I just want to say that we love you in advance. All right. Because it is going down. So we're just going to jump right into it. And I'm going to go ahead with the first question that we have. Here it is. How long have you been in a leadership position at Dance Place? And what was it like coming into a position where the climate and culture of the organization already had a certain dynamic?
Well, I want to acknowledge my mutual admiration and love and respect for you all too, and thank you for inviting me into this series of conversations you all are putting together. It's really such an important time for us, not just Dance Place, all of us, to look really closely at ourselves in the mirror and make sure we're right with ourselves. And I think this conversation today will be a good test for me. I have been Dance Place's executive artistic director for 3 years now, and that was following the retirement of our founding director, Carla Perlow, who had been in her position for 37 years, and her co-director, Deborah Riley, retired at the same time. Deborah had been in that position of co-director for 19 years, but has a longer history with Dance Place as well. And so actually social media reminded me this morning that it was 3 years ago today that I stopped by Dance Place to start to meet some of the young people in our annual summer camp prior to my officially beginning work there, but just as a way to start to get to know the programs a little better. And I have a long history with Dance Place. I first encountered Dance Place in 1998. I had moved to Washington, D.C. to dance with Liz Lerman and the Liz Lerman Dance Exchange, now known just as the Dance Exchange. And prior to arriving here, some colleagues and friends had said, oh, you definitely need to get to know Dance Place when you move to Washington, D.C. It is an important hub of dance in that city. And my first performance with Liz's company was at Dance Place. And it was an evening of dancer choreographed works, and Liz was very generous to invite me to perform a solo that I'd been working on at the time. And so, yeah, just a short few weeks after I'd moved here, I went into Dance Place and have known the institution ever since. Prior to my leadership role, they had supported me as an individual artist as well. And I think that's really kind of what brought me to this role. I think we'll talk a little bit more about leadership throughout this, but I come to leadership from having been a working artist for 20 years now, over 20 years. And so my sense of arts administration is greatly informed by being an artist. And so something, you asked about the dynamic that was already there. It was really important to the search committee, which was made up of several of Dance Place's board members, that the organization continue to be artist-led. Carla and Deborah are both wonderful choreographers in their own right. And so as the search process went on and the interviews went further and further, I made it clear that, that is my background, is in the arts. And to that, I can add arts administration, but it was art first. And that was very valued by the institution. So I think that's part of the dynamic that I was entering, is this long history of being artist-led.
Just thinking about the amount of time that you have been around Dance Place and the amount of support that you've been given by Dance Place in its past leadership, and now being in this leadership position, how has your particular background and upbringing and your culture guided you in your position at Dance Place?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's a little bit of a long story in some ways. I'm going to start in the middle. So most of my dance career was in heavily Western influence forms. I grew up in Southern California, just an hour south of LA. And so when I was about 17 years old, I was introduced to jazz, ballet, and a little bit after that, modern dance. And so that quickly became an all-consuming passion. And by the age of 19, much to the surprise, I might even say disappointment, of my parents, I dropped out of college and started to pursue dance full time. Ryan's thumbs up because I think he has a similar parallel story, right, Ryan?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
Yes. And so, in a way, I kind of ran away with the circus. It wasn't the literal circus, but it was the circus of dance, right? It just kind of swept me off my feet and became my all-consuming passion. And it was very good to me. The dance world that I was connected to really embraced me and the totality of me. And it was in those forms where I think I started to better fully realize myself as a human. I became more comfortable with myself. I became more comfortable with my sexuality. Now I'm happily married to another man. Um, I just started to grow into my own skin in a way that I hadn't found prior to that. Part of that was the age I was at in my late teens and early 20s, and part of that was the embrace that I had from the dance community. And I think that's really important in this moment we're in now, where we as a dance community need to look really critically at ourselves and make sure we are embracing everyone. But so back to this journey. So, I was doing all of these Western influence forms, learning more, expanding, growing, deepening as an artist. And then I started to become interested in making dances. And so now this is 12 years later into my career. And as a dance maker, I started to ask myself lots of questions about identity. And it was a nice intersection and overlap of the personal and the professional. And I found that I was able to explore my own identity through my creative work as a choreographer. And part of that is my background as being Native Hawaiian. So here's where I'll jump to the beginning of the story. I said I started in the middle. When I was a child, I'm the youngest of 8 children. I have 5 sisters and 2 brothers. And together as a family, we danced all the dances of Polynesia. And we learned from aunts and uncles and cousins. So we would do dances from Hawaii, which is where part of my bloodline comes from, Tahiti, Aotearoa, or New Zealand, Samoa, Tonga. And we did this as a family, and we did little performances in the community where we lived in Orange County, California. And so that was actually my first dance career. So then all these years later, after this career in these heavily Western influence forms, I had started to notice these muscle memories. These movements in my muscles and bones would come out a lot of times as a dancer and other people's choreographic practices when we were asked to make movement phrases, for example, as part of a task of generating material for a piece. I found myself connecting to things that I had done in hula. There were gestures of the hands that would come up. And it had been decades since I had done that form really properly. But it was, of course, still in my body, right? And maybe even deeper in my DNA, my blood, my bones. So that started a lot of curiosity for me. And when I did really start to make, I realized that was one of the lenses with which I wanted to create work, is how does this Native identity show up in my work now? And, it was really a lot of unpacking. And this is where it gets to like my leadership now. I realized that so much of my hard work ethic kind of comes from an identity politic of aspiring to be good enough and trying to be the model minority, super big air quotes around that, right? But like this idea that as a light brown, sometimes passing, often ethnically ambiguous person, I could kind of glide through places. And not that I didn't experience questions or racism or interrogation, but also a lot of times I could just kind of glide through somewhat unnoticed. And so I realized that I had created a way of functioning in the world that was in response to these systems around me. And I say this now because, these systems are what we're interrogating and should be interrogating so much. So that culture and that upbringing, Quinn, it really influenced so many things. It sort of shaped the way I worked. My parents are both incredibly hardworking, and I take that work ethic from them. But I realize, as 2 folks who had left the Hawaiian Islands, each of my parents, prior to knowing each other and then meeting each other in the military, and very thoughtfully choosing to stay in the continental United States to raise their family after they married, because of the economic opportunities that were in the continental United States in the 1950s and not present in the Hawaiian Islands. This was part of an identity politic, right? And I don't think my parents would ever phrase it that way. But as I unpack all of this now, years later, and I'm trying to sort out my own self, and also how through the leadership's roles that I am so privileged to inhabit, how can I help support others? So all of these questions brought me on a big artistic journey. And I think this is so critical because at the heart of it all is art. I really try and lead everything with my art heart. And so I had all these questions about this hula coming out of my body in modern dance contexts. And so I realized, I need to learn more about hula. I was such a small child when I learned that it wasn't having the intellectual grip on my mind, the spiritual connection to my heart that that form and so many of our other forms ask of us. Really, a deep, deep connection is needed. And as a child, I think I sensed a lot of that, but I didn't remember it or know it. So I started a journey, and I'm still on it. I'm still quite in the early stages, I would say, of my learning process of hula, to learn more about my Native Hawaiian background and hula, and to connect to the language. My parents both grew up during a cultural suppression, so neither of them fully speak the language. There's little bits of words that were in our household. Mostly, the imperative directives of go to sleep, time for moi moi, eat, time to call, these kinds of things. That was in our dialect, and of course the music was around our home. But I grew up in some ways quite separate from the culture because of the cultural suppression. So I really realized I needed to learn more, and I started this process of studying hula with my late cousin's hula group, and now that's expanded to include other teachers as well. And I feel so fortunate to have that connection. So all of these things kind of have been weaving through my Western background, and I am part white. I'm also Japanese and Chinese. So all of these things have been weaving through my own self and my own life and creating an identity politic that I've been working to understand fully so that I can bring my full self to conversations like this, to the work that I do, to the ways that I'm trying to create bridges and support other artists through Dance Place, and through my own work as a choreographer. I said it was a long story, and that doesn't even feel like it's fully conclusive, but I think that's sort of how some of the upbringing and culture have guided me into this position at Dance Place.
So Dance Place really has strong roots in the dance community in the DC metropolitan area, right? It has constantly taken risk and chance, and they've worked. Some have worked, some have not worked, right? That's business. That's what this is. Um, with your upbringing, especially surrounding identity, because when we look at the climate of of our nation, it really is about a lack of appreciation of identity for Black bodies, right? That's one of the things that we are we're dealing with. But your work and everything that you've done is centered, right? Christopher K. Morgan, an artist, it's all about identity, right? And that's what we're discussing and working with. So knowing the climate of the country, knowing where we are, knowing that the one of the first two artists in residence under your direction is a Black owned and operated company that directly uses art as a tool and as a weapon to address social injustice. Why is it important for you to be a part of this conversation now versus a year ago or a few months ago? Because everyone loves Black people right now, right? Why now?
There's a lot to say to this. Why now? Because centering Blackness is critical. We have seen such ongoing violence against Black bodies from our own government, from our own law enforcement, that though the arts is not the center of that, the arts needs to center the importance of our Black community. Specifically with Dance Place, as you said, Dance Place has this incredible history of supporting artists of so many identities, and of risk taking. And risk taking is, you kind of framed it as part of business, right? It's an important part of business. Without risk, there won't be the next big thing. If I were more of a capitalist, I might say profit. Without risk, there might be profit. But profit for us, or success for us, is not defined by dollars. It's defined by impact and the lives we reach and the folks we connect and the folks we can hopefully hold or lift up. Dance Place is a microcosm of the city we're in. And Washington, D.C. is, and its surrounding areas, the DMV, even up to Baltimore, where Ryan, you are, and you have such history there, we're a microcosm of what's happening there. And interestingly, because we're the nation's capital, I think in a way we're also a microcosm of the entire country, but in like this very condensed, almost distilled way. Washington, D.C. has been going through a lot of tough changes, right? We're seeing what once was known as Chocolate City and had something like 80% Black residents. Now it's just over 50%. And feel free to check my statistics on that. But we've definitely been seeing this shift, right? My numbers might not be exactly right, but we've been seeing this shift. And it's gentrification, right? As the city transforms, as new real estate developments come in, it becomes harder and harder for long-standing residents, and in this case, predominantly Black folks, to survive in the new economic realities of this city. And that's where Dance Place, I think, has done some really great work, and we can continue to do more work. When Carla Perlow and her board at the time in 1985 were priced out of their lease in Adams Morgan, and she bought through Dance Place this building that we now inhabit in Brookland Edgewood. It was a very, very different neighborhood than it is now. It was historically Black, high home ownership for many, many decades historically in that neighborhood. And now there are all these new developments, and it's a real challenge. When I became the director of Dance Place, I started to learn about and meet all of the developers in the neighborhood, because our voice there is strong and important and powerful, but it's one of many, many voices. There are all these charter schools in the neighborhood. There are really important, civic associations that are trying to make sure that their needs are being met. And so our role in this neighborhood, as a reflection of what's happening in the entire city, is critical. We are trying to find a balance between how we advocate for mindful development that supports the Black families that have been there for so long, while recognizing that this is much larger than just one small arts institution. It's the whole city that needs to be engaged in this conversation. And it's a little bit of an offshoot of the why now, but to bring it back to that, as that neighborhood continues to develop and evolve and change, the demographics change. And if we're not engaged in these important conversations around centering Blackness in the arts and the visibility of Black artists on our stage and in our classrooms, then how that reflects out and radiates out in that neighborhood and then in our city, we're not doing the appropriate work and service to that very important part of our community. And I'll just add one other thing, which is that, Dance Place has, with that historically and predominantly Black neighborhood and in this city, audience statistics vary, but it's been more than 50% of our audiences in general in our history have identified as Black, African American, or person of color. Oftentimes up to closer to 60%. Our youth programs have a variety, and that shifted in recent years because of the different demographics we serve, but predominantly Black and POC. And I can talk about more of that specifically. I know, Quinn, you're always hot on the education questions. And then our board actually is a good reflection of the city we live in. Over 50% of our board is Black or self-identified POC. The area where we need the most growth and development, and sorry, our artists on stage, similarly, much like, yourselves. You started this by saying a Black-owned business, soul-defined. That's happened historically at Dance Place for many, many years throughout Carla and Deborah's leadership and mine, just making sure that we're reflecting the community we live in by inviting those artists onto our stage. The area where we need to grow and develop the most is in our administrative staff. And this is a huge unpacking conversation about who has access and ability to learn about arts administration, who can afford a low-paying job, because there's some risk involved in being an arts administrator. It's not the most well-paid position in the world. One might argue also, though, neither is being in the arts. So there's, all these delicacies of privilege in there, and totally acknowledge that. But that's another area, and why it's really important that we're involved in this conversation now. Not only do we want to help support artists, but we want to see who's in the leadership roles come into better balance and shift.
And I just want to jump in a little off script from that, because I wrote down, does dance place past the programming reflect the demographic of the DC slash community it serves? We as artists who walk the halls of dance place. Um, Dance Place is the home of Dance Africa. Dance Place is the home of Soul Defined. Dance Place is the home of Christopher K. Morgan and all of these dope BIPOC companies, or events or celebrations happened. But when you, like you said, when you walk through the admin office, we don't see the diversity. You're actually the only diversity that we see. Trying to think to make sure before I say, my point is that there's a very small percentage of people who don't identify as white in the admin space. And they are amazing people. They do great work. I want to acknowledge that. My question is how have the events that have brought us these rising actions that have brought us to this climax, how have they inspired your next steps? How have, as a leader, what what do you do? What do you feel? Because you're a human first, and then you're a leader. So how do you balance that space? And what are the next steps that you are taking to make sure that in that space, which is a very important space, has a little more of a fusion of culture and background?
That's the work right now, is trying to figure that out. I wish I knew exactly how to do it, but I'm deeply committed to figuring it out and trying things. And I think an important part of it is to try things. Um, One of the things I appreciate dance places, it's large enough and has enough history and kind of energy and muscle to do things, and yet it's small enough to be nimble and responsive and adapt. And so I think um, our desire to try and to hopefully listen and learn is critical. So this conversation series is just one tiny thing. But when Ryan and Quynn, you texted me, and it was about 2 days into the the upcoming, what was at that time a peaking trajectory towards social reform, social justice protest. And I had been, just personally as a human, a little bit like stuck in that overwhelmed feeling of like, pardon my language, but God damn it, some shit needs to change, and how? And like just feeling that overwhelmed, like, how do we change these enormous problems? And I was so moved and motivated that you all reached out and had this idea to start a series of really critical conversations about the dance field's complicity in white supremacy and systemic racism. I was so grateful because it gave me an opportunity to just snap out of it and say, actually, you can do things. You can get involved. You can host conversations. You can have, important conversations with arts leaders, with our community, and engage them and involve them to better affect programmatic shifts, to better affect your neighborhood, to better affect the city you live in. So, that happened, and within days we were putting together the first panel, and we had a little bit of financial resources and some great technical resource, and it was all able to happen really quickly. And I think that it was a huge experiment. You both know, we were like, what's going to happen? Is anybody going to tune in? How's it going to turn out? Is the Wi-Fi going to work? All of these very real things confluencing together. And not that conversation is enough, because it's not, but I think it speaks to our willingness to just give it a try and to learn from it and to listen. And all of our staff tuned in, a lot of our board members tuned in. We've all been talking about what sparked in those first two conversations. So I think the unique position we have to have a little bit of energy and resources to jump into things and try things. And something that I said to the two of you that I will say here in this public format is, what I hope happens is, now that we had those really big, intense conversations that are distilling and boiling down to important, focused conversations that almost spring forth from that, I hope that this next the next step after that will be that informs the programmatic changes that we can and should make at Dance Place and the field, right? It's almost like we're doing the research with a group of artists, arts administrators, and leaders to help inform our next steps. So, yeah, I think, just going back to your question and trying to be sure that I'm answering it thoroughly, I think our nimbleness is part of it. You said, you as a human, it's tough to find the balance of activism and care. And that might mean self-care, that might mean care for our existing staff, that might mean care for artists that we're in dialogue with. You know, I will say we are working with great care, and sometimes it feels like it's not fast enough, it's not enough, but we're at Dance Place really trying to ask ourselves tough questions and figure out what can we do to be in service to our community. And our community, we serve a lot of communities. We serve artists, we serve our neighbors, we serve the audiences that come to see those shows by artists. We serve our teachers who are also artists themselves, but have this double gift, just like you, Quinn, of being an educator and a teacher and an artist. We serve all these different folks, all these concentric circles of folks that we're trying to serve. And sometimes those things might feel like they're in tension with one another. And so, trying to hear and listen and have that inform what we do, I think is part of that. I think I might have talked myself in a circle there, Quinn.
It's totally okay. I wanted to thank you for acknowledging the need to center Black bodies as being critical, because it definitely is. And I want to bring up kind of a sticky situation that happened when we were first preparing to do the very first panel conversation. And it was a question of, well, not a question, but Ryan and I received a little bit of pushback from some community members that found out that we were doing this conversation with Dance Place, and Dance Place was backing or supporting and creating this space for us. And I just want to know, what would you want to say to that, or to those people that are questioning?
Mm-hmm. One, I think, as hard as it is to hear or receive pushback sometimes, I also am so glad that it's happening, that any folks, feel like they can come forward and speak truth. And whatever happens with that reaction, you can only be in charge of the effort. So one, I appreciate that. And there are moments where I'm getting and receiving information or feedback or pushback, and I have the very natural human responses of like, well, wait, no, let me think about this, right? A defensive posture. But I appreciate that, because as it is important to center Blackness and artists on stage in our studios and our classrooms, etc., Black leadership is critical. And you all are a Black-owned business, as you said, being supported by a Native-led, historically white, mixed community Dance Place. And to that direct feedback about us supporting you in this, one, you are a pair of artists, a collaborative of artists, actually, when I think of all the choreographers and musicians, dancers you work with, that we are deeply invested in. So if you all come to us and have an idea, we're going to figure out as best as we are able how to support you, because we have a history and a relationship, a history that predates my time. I think of Dance Place supporting you all prior to my time there, and you have a long relationship with Ben Levine, our director of production, who makes Ryan's fantastical ideas come to life in not enough time a lot of the time. So there's a depth of history here between us. So there's that, right? That's real important value. But maybe even bigger than that is, I'm a big believer in effective change has to come from many different angles. So it takes the protesters on the street making noise, breaking some stuff, tearing some stuff down, right? Right? It takes that perspective. It takes the solutions-oriented conversations It takes the infiltrators moving into institutions or into businesses to affect change. It takes the Black-owned businesses working in collaboration or in allyship or partnership with white-led businesses. It takes all these different approaches. And I've known for myself in my own experience that Dance Place is a meeting point. It's a nexus where lots of different folks come together. So I think to push back about us supporting this, I hear that and I can receive that. And I can also say that our partnership, our long history is coming to this with good intentions to help build a strong allyship, a multifaceted allyship to affect positive change. And that takes many, many folks doing many different kinds of work, in my
Yes,
opinion.
yes, it does. It does. It definitely does. And that actually is the perfect segue into my next question before we go into our artist spotlight, and we can all have some water and shake it off and come back for some more conversation. Um, it takes so much work to make change to systems that have been set in stone and are the learned behaviors of so many. My question is, because Dance Place can't fix everything in the dance community. You can only control what happens in the dance place, under the Dance Place umbrella. So my question to you um, is two-part. Was there ever a race issue within the Dance Place administration before you took leadership that we just don't know about, and that's why we received the pushback? If so, um, how do you address it? How do you address it? How do you adjust it? How do you make sure that someone who had an experience doesn't have that experience again? If that's a patron, or is that a choreographer or a guest artist or a renter or a teacher or whatever, what are the tangible action items that you're at least thinking about as you progress forward as the leader of Dance Place?
In a 37-year history prior to my arrival, um, I can't even imagine all the interactions that happened, all the ways that something could have happened between any number of folks. Our incredible former leadership, Carla and Deborah, former board members, faculty teaching youth and adults, artists, tech staff, all these different people coming together. So I don't know of specific really intense issues, but I do know that the systemic racism and white supremacy that infects everyone is part of the system that we are privy to. It's in our funding systems. It's in how, spreadsheets are utilized to help track information. It shows up in some of the most surprising ways that I don't even fully always understand, right? That's my own personal work to do. So I can imagine that there have been missteps. What I do know is that there are some really good intentioned folks that have been doing this work. What I do know is that sensibilities change over time. I think back to words I used to use that I look back on now and realize how offensive that might have been, how ableist it might have been, how racist it might have been. And so that's just our own learning. I have to imagine that that's part of a 37-year history. And especially when I think of, the 80s and the 90s. Remember the 90s when everyone was trying to be like a Benetton ad, and have like all the different skin colors in and multiculturalism. I mean, that sounds so offensive now, but that was like a step in a long journey. So then I want to speak more specifically about some things going on at Dance Place, but I can't imagine that missteps weren't happening, and that there were really well-intentioned people that I know at the leadership level steering the ship. That being said, one of the biggest inequities that I feel when we were talking about our administrative staff, and Ryan, you had to pause and be like, who else do I walk by in the hallways that might be POC? The place where we have the most representation of Black Black staff members is in our education staff. And there are some important reasons why they're there. If we're serving mostly Black youth, we want to make sure that they are being taught by folks who they can see themselves reflected in that teaching leadership. And that's really important. And I'm glad that that happens. The structure of many of our education programs, for those of you that don't know Dance Place super well, we have these after-school youth enrichment programs. They've been around for many, many years. They're called the Energizers, and junior staff is for teens, and the Children's Education Center, Creative Education Center, the CEC, are for younger than teens, like 8 to 12-year-olds. Almost all of those children are Black in those two programs. That transitions into our summer camp every summer. So those two programs, the way they're structured, the education staff are part-timers. So that's where we have this huge inequity. We have full-time administrators who currently are white, and we're talking about this within our own staff, so no one would be surprised to hear me say this that's working at Dance Place, nor would our board members. We're talking about this kind of inequity of the structures of things. Not only do we need to identify and work with more Black arts administrators to come into these positions, we also need to look at the inequity, and this is something that I think we can do perhaps even sooner than creating new jobs. We can start to equalize the field for how our educators are staffed and paid, to just better address one of the problems we have inside our own institution. Another problem we have, I was saying Dance Place is this nexus where many different types of people come together. We need to constantly check ourselves and make sure that we are being as welcoming as we can to as many different folks as we can. I'm looking at this screen with our ASL interpreters and an incredible person who advocated for ASL interpretation and other accessibility points with me 2 years ago. And it took a long time to get here, too long, and I own that. And so we need to constantly look at ourselves. It goes from accessibility to just general welcomingness. How is our studio manager saying, hey, Ryan, how you doing? Welcome to Dance Place. And if they don't know you, hi, welcome to Dance Place. Who are you? To make sure we're fostering that environment. That's not easy. It's not easy. It's not always cheap. Sometimes it costs resources, all of these things to make sure people are trained and remunerated well and supported. But this is something that we have to do better at. And I don't think we were doing terribly badly at it, but I think we just need to do a lot better. Yeah, I can say a lot more about that, but I'm going to pause there and maybe we should pick it up again. Whew.
Yeah, we'll pick up right after our artist spotlight. One of the things that Soul Defined that we wanted to do to help combat the white supremacy in the rubrics of grants, in the rubrics of showcase applications, in the ability to attend presenter conferences is we wanted to highlight an artist on each episode, because we think it's important to create a lane and a space for voices of artists and practitioners of color, who may not have been selected simply because of the quality of their video or the graininess of their video or whatever reason. But it was really important for us to make sure that we took the time to spotlight a company that we think you will enjoy, or an artist that we think you may enjoy. And Quinn and I just love them. So that's why we selected them. All that to say is we're going to go ahead as the panelists and moderators and ASL, grab some water. We're going to allow you to check out our artist spotlight, who is Charles Anderson. Here we go.
Hi, my name is Charles O. Anderson. I'm pleased to be an artist spotlight and thank Soul Defined and Dance Place for the opportunity. I wanted to share with you excerpts of my latest work, Recurrent Unrest, that is inspired by James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time and Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. The piece is performed by and in dialogue with millennials and Generation Z dancers of color, trying to make sense of blatant racial injustice and come to grips with our place in a world that refuses to guarantee us the freedoms that so many others take for granted. Ultimately, the piece is an open letter to the generations behind me to stay woke. The piece is built on the sonic foundations of white minimalist composer Steve Reich, which is drawing from his earliest works that stands on the sonic foundations of African American voices. The work is intended to be interactive and a catalyst for community engagement and discourse. We look forward to sharing with you our virtual film this fall. Thank you.
We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union.
He began to warn the people. He said, after all, it's going to rain after all for 40 days and for 40 nights. And the people didn't believe him. And they began to laugh at him. And they began to mock him. And they began to say, it ain't going to rain.
God gave Noah the rainbow sign. No more water. The fire next time. God gave Noah the rainbow sign. God gave Noah the rainbow sign. God gave Noah the rainbow sign. The fire next time. God gave Noah the rainbow sign. No more water. The fire next time.
Yes, let's give it up. Let's give it up for Charles. His work is so dope. I first came in contact with him at NPN, National Performance Network. This was it last year, Chris? We were there in New Orleans. Yeah, really, really powerful speaker, and just great choreographer. So yeah, but now that we're back, it's time for me to continue this. Now, this is a question that we have had, and we continue to talk about. We see these um, advocacy statements. These statements, it's almost like everyone hired the same firm to write their "We stand with Black people. We love Black people. Black people are the best thing in the world today" statement. The question is, did you or the organization feel pressure to craft a statement standing against racial injustice, or like what was that process? What was that thought? What was that energy? That feeling? Because Quinn and I know, because we were in direct contact with you almost 20 hours a day for 4 days straight as we were trying to navigate in real time. But I really would like for our viewers and guests to get more of an understanding of where you stood with the advocacy statement thing. Yeah.
Yeah. That Friday, so as I recall, the protest movement was really like getting lit on Thursday night in Minneapolis and elsewhere, but that's when it like really soaked into my skin. This was right after the terrible Monday, when George Floyd was killed, murdered. And so fast forward a couple days, reading that news, processing that news, just absorbing that terrible horror. That same week, just the universe had it. Like there was a lot going on with arts budgeting in Washington, D.C. Just happened to be the budget cycle. So I had a lot of energy and focus going on there, just advocacy work, not just, but it was taking up a lot of my time. So on Friday morning, after some really intense protests, I didn't participate, just was reading in the news, and I was like, okay, this is a new tipping point, so to speak. I thought we, as an organization that amplifies the voices of many Black artists and serves many community members from the Black community, we need to be ready to respond to this. And at that point, we weren't seeing a lot of these statements yet. So I wrote it down on my Friday to-do list. And then Friday just kind of was a lot of stuff. Not an excuse, but just a lot of stuff going on. And that later that day was when I saw an incredible statement from Dance NYC. Dance NYC is a service organization based in New York City that provides advocacy, programming for the broader New York City dance community. Its incredible executive director, Alejandra Duke, I just find her to be visionary. So whenever she puts out a statement or her institution, I always pay attention. And I thought it was incredibly powerful, mindful, and inclusive. And then I really thought, okay, Christopher, you got to get on this. And that was Friday evening, right? Dance Place's statement came out Monday midday. And in that time, I started to hear from folks, where's Dance Place? Where y'all at? Y'all need to step into a conversation with everyone. Rightfully so. I just lost Saturday. I was taking care of myself. And, that might not have been the right choice, but it was a choice that I made. I was feeling a kind of way about the violence and the protesting, and I needed to take care of myself for a day. And later that day is when you all texted me, and I was reignited, and I was like, great, this is how I can do in my unique, specific personness and roles. Here's how I can do something. Thank you, Soul Define, for the invitation and the call in to step up. And then one of our incredible education staff members, Anastasia Johnson, had emailed the entire staff at Dance Place and called us in and said, you all need to do better. Here's some ways you need to do better to be more welcoming and inclusive of the young people on our campus, to make sure that you are being welcoming and inclusive of the Black and brown bodies that do so much of the work at Dance Place. Just really an important call in. And I shared it with the board. I was like, from top to bottom, side to side, down to up, forward to backward, we all need to be in this conversation together. So it was in this time that now we're starting to craft a statement. And so I wanted to work quickly but thoroughly. And so involved a few staff members, including Anna, who had sent that email that I just referenced, and our board chair. Our board chair, the incredible Denise Rollins, also an African-American woman who had this incredible career in foreign diplomacy in a time where very few women, I think, held the kind of positions that she did at USAID, as well as women of color, for sure. So I involved those folks in these conversations and crafting the statement, and it took us till midday Monday to get something that everyone felt good about. But in addition to it being a statement, it was critical to me that it had not just what we were going to say or what we believe, but what we were going to do. And part of that was a commitment to these conversations, to have these conversations inform how we move forward. Part of that was to embark on an Undoing Racism training with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. Part of that was to take the time to listen, to ask ourselves the hard questions. We're in the process of that. So I think even though maybe it was around 72 hours from when I first started seeing the statements roll out, and I could have missed a bunch, there might have been some that happened earlier. In some ways it felt too long. to be able to respond to our community who was asking to hear from us. And in some ways I could have imagined taking a little more time to have been more thoughtful about it. So it's that difficult, it's, with anything, you want to make sure it's thorough, but it gets out in a timely fashion, right? And so I didn't want it to be just words. I wanted to make sure that we were starting a series of actions, and that's going to be ongoing work. It's not one statement. We did a follow-up on Juneteenth that sort of shared with our community some steps that had happened in that time in between. I don't know, much like phases of reopening for the pandemic, I don't think it's going to be tied to calendar dates. It's going to be tied to the actions that are happening. So I think our Dance Place community can expect to hear from us from time to time to know how we're doing and to hear from us, here's some other steps that we've taken in our ongoing work. And at the same time that work is centered and happening, a lot of other work is happening too, that hopefully porously goes back and forth and feeds one another in a way that takes words into action. But yeah, it was a quick and tricky journey to get to publishing that statement.
And thinking about that statement, and so many arts organizations and organizations of all types are out here making statements. And I believe our first panel that Mama Okua Kiyate Tate was on, she mentioned she didn't really care about the statements. It's about the actions behind the statements, to which you just mentioned the actions that you all are going to be taking. I want to know, what advice do you have for other organizations? And specifically, there have been a few in the DC area that have been receiving some backlash for some systemic things that have been happening over the years. What advice would you have?
It's hard to, in an environment where through social media and other platforms, emails, it's easy to get feedback really quickly. And I think it inspires a lot of quick responses. And sometimes that's important and good, but I think it's also important to really think things through as well, so that whether it's just words or words in action, it is a true reflection of the intent and the effort that has been and will be made. So partly, I think Dance Place has a long history of doing good work. That's not me. That's many, many people. It's also work done by humans. Humans are not perfect and they make mistakes. So I can stand by the good intention of this institution. And if I couldn't, that's when I think we need to better assess the change that's needed. So there's change needed at Dance Place, but it's change that I think we can adopt and foster with the folks that are there now. If in another institution, this important time that is inviting folks to look more closely at themselves reveals that the change needs to happen with who's at the table, literally changing who's running a place or who's on the board, that's a really difficult but important question to ask. And so I would advise to not be afraid of that change. There is a space where I think it's great to affect change in people and to open up to new ideas. I was owning ways that I have not used mindful language in the past, and I'm constantly working on that. And there's always more to do. If I stop working on that, I hope someone calls me in and says, Christopher, you're still using this language and I find it offensive. If I'm not responsive to it, then it's time for me to change. So if in another institution there's a resistance to important change that needs to happen, I would advise, rather than putting the energy towards the statement, look at what that change is and see if it can be affected. Can someone's heart and mind be shifted, or does that position need to shift? That's real tough. Wow.
Yeah, that's hard. That's hard. And I wanna bring actually, Chris, I want you to answer this question because I didn't ask this question. Quinn asked you a question. However, I got a message directly to me from Lisa Traeger, right? She just, as the young people say, she just slid into my DMs. And this is what she said. And I would like for you to speak on it because it seems that sometimes people can't hear the conversation because of their relationship. Sometimes our relationship is so deep and it runs so long. When we hear about things that don't settle with us, it makes us a little uncomfortable. It says, Ryan, I'm curious about why you are alluding to pushback without being specific. It feels like rumors without it sounds like rumors. Carla Parlow built an organization for almost 40 years that has been committed to BIPOC artists, audiences, and students. Christopher has built on and expanded the legacy. What are you alluding to? Could you comment about this? Because it seems that there's a misunderstanding of our position and our time and energy with Dance Place. Maybe, I don't know. But I want to open that on the floor because I know this is the time that we're supposed to take questions. And since it came directly to me, even though I didn't ask the question, I felt this was a great time to bring it up because that's kind of microaggression a little bit. So,
Well, and as I was kind of just saying to Quinn's question, like I really stand by so much of the long history of great work Dance Place has done. It doesn't mean there's not room for us, me, all of it to keep growing and improving. The pushback. I think
just so we're clear, the pushback is not from Soul Defined to Dance Place. Soul Defined and Dance Place are on one accord. We created this space because before we could have more conversations, we had to start with the source of the people that were assisting us, funding us, and backing our progression. So, to be very clear, the pushback is not from us. What Quinn stated, and I'm going to let Quinn speak on it, was that we, Soul Defined, received pushback. And Soul Defined then had to defend Dance Place. So, but sometimes we can't hear everything. So that's why I was hoping that we can have our first question to cover this and nip it in the bud very quickly.
Sure. The reason why I paused slightly is because there are parts of these conversations I was not directly in. But it was brought forward from the International Association of Blacks in Dance, which I consider a partner institution. We work with them at Dance Place in support of the new Davis Deal Commission for our annual Dance Africa Festival. We support one another in a number of ways. Denise Saunders Thompson and Carol are just incredible visionary leaders who I really appreciate and support. But my understanding of the situation is they just questioned why work with Dance Place for this platform. Perhaps a Black-led organization would be more appropriate. And please correct me if I'm misspeaking about that. But I think, I think that's a fair question to ask, right? It's, again, going back to some of the deficiencies that we feel at Dance Place and need to improve upon when there aren't as many Black voices in the administrative roles and we want to center Blackness in our work. That's problematic. So I think it's a totally fair question to ask. And I think that's why our institutional history, Dance Place and Soul Defined, our interpersonal business relationships as people, our interest in solutions-oriented work and trying to further the field and support one another's businesses was the why for me. I don't know if either of you want to add on to that.
I want to jump in because I actually asked the question. So, from my perspective, Ryan and I received a tap on our shoulder from an elder in the community that had a question, and she brought it to us directly. And no matter how we felt about the conversation or the question, she wanted to ask it, and so it is our responsibility to answer. And from that dialogue, it actually sparked an idea within us to have a one-on-one, this actual panel conversation that we're having right now, to ask questions to you and to Dance Place to get some clarity, because I personally am from Flint, Michigan. So I don't have a background here in Washington, D.C. to know if there were things preceding Soul Define being an artist in residence. So it was important that we speak to you directly and ask this question and be transparent, humble, open, and transparent, and bring it to the table. So there wasn't anything to allude to in the conversation or by me bringing up the question either. And I particularly think it's important to be addressed so that everybody is clear.
Yeah, I mean, thank you both for speaking on that, and it was really important for me to address that because Lisa does a lot of great work that ends up in a lot of great newspapers. It ends up in a lot of great spaces. You know, she has been an advocate for Dance Place and for performing arts for years. She's a pillar in the community, and I did not want to answer that in a DM, and like I told her, I'm going to answer this question directly on the live platform because one of the things that I love so much about being an artist in residence at Dance Place is the transparency in the conversations that we have. I sometimes, even as a leader of a company, I'll come to Chris's office and I'm like, yeah, so I want to do this, but I don't know if it's going to work. And it's because it's a sensitive topic. Artists have always had the responsibility of addressing the realities of the world. Our job is to take what's happening in real time and create art that not only entertains the masses, but it educates them on ways that we can evolve and enhance, or even if it's just historical content. So I want to be very clear that Soul Define supports Dance Place as Dance Place supports Soul Define. This is a relationship that we have been working on for years, and these are conversations that we are having because we are a Black-led organization that is under the Dance Place umbrella. And I appreciate that Christopher and the staff literally was like, yo, talk to us, guide us, help us. Let's have these conversations. It was an open forum. It wasn't a space of, well, we're the organization. We know what to do, and we do it. It wasn't that. It actually was very intimate. I mean, text messages at 11 o'clock at night, phone calls, 3 or 5 Zoom calls a day, so I just want to make that very clear, that this conversation is in place because we recognize a space at Dance Place that we need to help evolve. And that's why we're here. We're here to help the evolution and the forward trajectory of Dance Place because we value Dance Place and Dance Place values us. And we couldn't have these conversations with other organizations without putting Christopher K. Morgan in the hot seat first.
Well, and that transparency you talked about is so key. So Lisa, hi Lisa, it's great that you're connecting with us right now. I appreciate the directness of the question. And I think, it's always a delicate balance, right? You're trying to be transparent, and you also don't want to stoke fires that don't need stoking. Our friends at the International Association of Blacks in Dance are doing critical, important work right now. There was another conversation that I was a part of at the Association of Performing Arts Presenters. I was moderating a conversation with 4 other arts leaders, and Denise was in the chat saying, y'all are sidestepping the issues. Get to it. Talk about centering Blackness. And we tried, we pivoted the conversation to start talking about that. And it was a right call-in or a good call-in. So when we were talking about a little earlier in a different context, accountability, basically, we need lots of folks to keep us accountable. I hope it can happen in ways that help us all continuing to do the work. That's what I'm interested in, is like calling in and then working in partnership to keep the work going. And I feel great support and partnership from the folks at IABD. I think it's a great question to ask. And that's our answer. We're two organizations that are working together.
I just thinking about what you said about calling in and having mama, sister, auntie, like tapping on your shoulder, and this network of arts directors. Do you all have a group text chain that you are calling each other in on? Because I know that my phone blows up if I am out of pocket. And I'm wondering, what is that network like? Like, are y'all up at night on group me? Like, what's happening?
At Dance Place, actually, we're trying with mixed success to not be all up in each other's messages and emails in the late night and in the early morning. We're trying to keep better business hours. It's not always easy. We're an arts organization. There's weekend events and nighttime events. Continuing even in this time of the pandemic and a lot of shelter-in-place directives in different communities, we're still doing weekend and evening conversations and online performances. But we're trying to make sure we're giving each other personal space. But that being said, yeah, whenever something hot is happening, there are probably many threads that I'm not on as executive artistic director. I imagine staff, board, teachers having all kinds of conversations without me. And there are some that I am on too. And also there are some great communities nationwide of sort of peer institutions that I've been in conversation with. I think we all have been experiencing this in our own lives in different ways since various shelter-in-place directives came into our lives back in mid-March, depending on exactly where you lived. Connecting via platforms like Zoom and GoToMeet and all of that has just really changed how we're communicating. So there's like a couple of groups of venues and curators that I check in with once every week or every couple of weeks. And it's just been a lovely way to sort of, connect with how folks are responding in their different communities. A lot of those folks are folks that work at venues that you all met at the various NPN conferences. And it's a nice way to just keep a pulse on how different communities are responding. It was great to hear from folks, in Seattle at an earlier part of the pandemic when when Washington State was such a hot spot and concerns that they were going through happened prior to us. It was great to stay connected to the national network as the social justice protests for Black Lives Matter really started to reignite, and hear how different communities, in Minneapolis or New Orleans or LA, how the arts institutions in those communities were kind of responding. So there are a few different ways that we, light up each other's phones, so to speak. But we're also at Dance Place trying to make sure we're not lighting each other's phones up at dinner time.
That part. Well, Christopher, I just want to say on behalf of Sodafine, we appreciate you being open and honest and transparent and acknowledging the success of Dance Place, but also acknowledging the spaces in which Dance Place needs growth and the growth in which will be happening over the next however amount of years. We appreciate your leadership. You know what I mean? I just want to make that very clear. I do have comments that I want to say, but I'm going to stay on my best behavior and open the floor up for any questions that our viewers may have. If you drop your questions into the chat, we will go ahead and answer them directly. I feel like that's the most appropriate place to ask a question versus in someone's DMs. But we'll go ahead and take this time. If you have any questions, please ask them. We are here to have solution-oriented conversations that work towards action items and next steps for the advancement of equality for BIPOC, which means Black, Indigenous people of color, who are practitioners of performing arts. So if you have any questions, go ahead and drop them. If not, Jonathan, if we can get prepared to close out. Of course, Chris, we have our one last question after we get the questions from our viewers. But excuse me. So yeah, live comments. Thank you so much. No? Okay. Lisa says, thank you very much for clarifying. Thank you so much for this. Hope to catch The remainder, yes. Okay, cool. Well, it doesn't look like we have any questions today. Our next episode, let me just pull out my planning tool, which is pen and paper, people. Pen and paper. Our next conversation will be on July 26th at 4 p.m. It's titled The Illusion of Inclusion, a conversation with Gregory King, who is an activist, scholar, artist. He will be hosting a panelist of amazing people. So make sure that you join us Sunday, July 26th at 4 p.m. Now, before we move on, Chris, the question of the day, we wanted to find ways to, Jonathan, we should get a drum roll or something, cue in here. We wanted to have innovative programming. And one of the things we wanted to ask people is what would be on your protest t-shirt? Yes, drum roll. What would be on your protest t-shirt? We're seeing t-shirts that say all kinds of things, and we're going to ask all our panelists to answer this question, and now it's time for you to answer it. What would you have printed on your protest t-shirt?
My protest t-shirt would say, re-indigenize my mind. I was talking about my own identity politics, right? And how I'm trying to pull apart some things, learn more about myself. And, the word decolonize has been popularized quite a bit. Mm-hmm. And like we were talking about language, it evolves and shifts. And, when you're decolonizing something, it puts the power in the hand of the colonizer. And so if you re-indigenize something, it just is a recentering and a moving back to Indigenous values. And for a while I used to be in platforms like this and public speaking engagements and talk about decolonizing my mind, trying to pull out these things that maybe don't need to be there, taking up space. And what I would like to do now is re-indigenize it and bring those values back. And I hope that actually re-indigenize, yeah.
That's dope.
Yeah.
I have to give credit to other, Native colleagues and friends who brought that forward. Larissa Fasthorse, an incredible playwright. Ty Defoe, an incredible dancer, playwright, actor, and many other folks, many other folks. So this is not a term that I coined. It is definitely, and that it's just in some of their circles that I started to hear it first. Re-indigenize.
And if you're watching, don't put that on a t-shirt without paying somebody for them words.
It's copywritten.
Don't be trifling out there.
If you do donate all the proceeds.
Right.
Yes.
For sure.
Goodness.
For sure. Thank you so much, Christopher. Thank you for being with us again tonight. And thank you to everybody who has been watching. As Ryan said, you want to definitely stay tuned for our next conversation that will be happening in 2 weeks on Sunday, July 26th at 4 p.m. Same time, same place, or same platform. And we look forward to seeing you there.
Yeah. And before we go, we have to plug our virtual dance class. So Defined hosts, we have a weekly class that is open to everyone, tap and body percussion, Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. on Zoom. For more information, you can go to danceplace.org. If you would like to share this content, it's not only on the Dance Place YouTube page, but it's also on the website. And you can find out more information on the topics, who's going to host and who's going to moderate, because Quinn and I are not going to do it every week. We're not. We have special guests to hold it down with dope panelists. If you are interested in next steps or continuing your racial education or actions you can take, here are a few of many sources to do so. We have also added a Google link to this information that we're dropping into the chat. If you are protesting, please stay safe. Everyone, please take care of yourself. And we will see you on July 26th with the illusion of inclusion. Peace.
Bye.
Thank you all.